All right, so we are going to start here with chapter 18, which is the cardiovascular system, and it starts out with blood. So the cardiovascular system is actually, we'll see in a moment on the next page, it consists of blood and the heart and the vascular system, or the blood vessels. So we're going to start with the blood. And I think this picture here is a really nice picture that shows some of the elements of blood that we'll be talking about. And right here you can see the red blood cell. This is the red blood cell, you can tell because it's biconcave, and we'll talk more about that. Over here we have the white blood cell, which is kind of granular and has these little things on the outside, which we'll also talk about. And then right here is a platelet. You can actually just see from this the different sizes. The white blood cells can be various sizes, so that's not always the case that it would be that size compared to the red blood cell. But the platelet here, you can tell, is much smaller than both of those, and that will be the case, and we'll see that going forward here. And so this is a scanning electron micrograph. This isn't something that we'd be able to see in cells in the laboratory. They would look different. It's just a different type of microscope. So we're going to move on to the first page here, and we are going to start talking about, at the beginning here, right above where it says an overview of the blood, we can see they give a little intro. Sorry, I've got a little throat thing. Where it talks about how single-celled organisms do not need blood. So perhaps in other classes you have talked about, probably in intro bio class, you've talked about single-celled organisms versus multicellular organisms, and there's just a little blurb here saying that the single-celled organism obtains nutrients directly from and excretes waste into their environment. So being a human, we're not able to do that. We're large, we have complex bodies, it needs blood to get all over the place. So we need to figure out a way to efficiently do that. Not only get blood and other nutrients, oxygen, other white blood cells and things like that all over the body. We also need to know how to remove, or a way to get rid of, the wastes in all of these cells that we have in our body. So the way we have done that, this body is able to do that through the use of blood and the cardiovascular system. So a little overview: the heart pumps the blood throughout the body in the network of blood vessels. And then the blood, as I mentioned, the heart and the vessels make up the whole cardiovascular system. So we're going to focus on the first part here, which would be blood. So remember here that from your 271 course, that blood is actually a connective tissue. So even though we may not think of it as a tissue per se, like muscular tissue or bone tissue, blood is actually its own type of tissue. So it contains the cellular elements and the extracellular matrix. So it has the two parts to it. The cellular elements are also referred to as the formed elements. That's mostly what they're called, is the formed elements. They include the red blood cells, they include the white blood cells, and then the platelets, which we saw that scanning electron micrograph of. The extracellular matrix in the case of blood is called plasma. So you may have heard of blood plasma. So we have the blood plasma, which is our extracellular, remember, outside of the cells matrix, and kind of holds together, or allows things to flow through it, in this case, the formed elements, which are the red blood cells, white blood cells, and the platelets. Here we talk about some of the functions of the blood. So the primary function here is to deliver oxygen and nutrients, and to remove the waste from the body cells. But there are a lot of other things. So when we think about the blood, that's probably the first thing we think of, which is correct, but some of the other functions include, it talks about here, defense, distribution of heat, and maintenance of homeostasis. So we're going to take a minute to go through some of these other functions of the blood. So first we have transportation. So the nutrients from the food we eat here is absorbed in the digestive tract. And we're going to talk more about the digestive system as we move further on into the semester. So you don't need to know specifics here at the moment, but you probably already know that we eat food, and as we eat the food, our digestive system is digesting it, and it breaks it down into these little tiny particles, little tiny molecules, and then these travel in the bloodstream directly to the liver, where they are processed and then released back into the bloodstream to go to all of the cells. So we need a way to get these things into the body, processed in a form that we can use them, and then get those to the cells that need them. And so the blood is great for that. It allows us to transport these things. Also allows us to transport oxygen from the air we breathe. So our lungs goes from the lungs and is transported through the blood and gets to all of the other cells. Moves from the lungs to the heart, it says here, and then it pumps out to the rest of the body. And then we have endocrine glands that are scattered throughout the body. And then as those endocrine glands, remember those excrete or secrete, and when they do that, they release their products, remember hormones, you should have remembered that from your 271 class, into the bloodstream, and then that carries them to the target cell. So we have the secretion, and then it gets to the target cell via the bloodstream. Blood also picks up these cellular wastes and byproducts and then transports them to the various organs for removal. So we're talking about blood taking things, for example, to the kidney. And then in the kidney, it's going to get rid of some of these cellular wastes, which we'll talk more about in the urinary system, and byproducts, and then remove them from the body via micturition or urination. So for instance, the blood moves carbon dioxide as the example here to the lungs for exhalation from the body. And down here, the kidneys and the liver for excretion from the body in the form of urine or bile, which we'll actually talk more about in this chapter specifically. Another function of blood is defense. So many types of white blood cells, that's the WBC there, white blood cells, protect the body from external threats, such as disease-causing bacteria. So when we get a cut, we have a whole situation that happens there that we'll talk very specifically about. And one of the things that happens is we have our white blood cells, and they travel through the blood and then work their way through other tissues. So sometimes muscle, sometimes other tissues, and sometimes not even tissues. It can just stay right in the bloodstream depending on the injury. And then those white blood cells are going to protect the body. So they're going to do what they do, and they're going to attack or whatever it is they do. We'll talk about the different types of bacteria that have entered into the wound. Here it does talk about generally the white blood cells that seek out and destroy internal threats. Those ones I had just kind of briefly mentioned that actually kind of walk their way through other tissues like muscular tissue and bone and things. So they can search out and destroy things like cells with mutated DNA that could then become cancerous. Or body cells that are infected with viruses. So it's another way that they're very helpful. They can seek out those viruses and then hopefully destroy them. So when the damage in the vessels results in bleeding, blood platelets and other proteins that are dissolved in the plasma, the extracellular matrix, interact to block the ruptured areas of the blood. And we're going to talk about clotting and how that occurs. And that's just one of the other ways that defense is a function of the blood. We can carry things to an area that has been damaged, and we can defend the body in that way. Another function is maintenance of homeostasis. So here it talks about specifically body temperature is regulated via the classic negative feedback loop. So hopefully you remember what a negative feedback loop is. So here they give the example, if you were exercising on a warm day, your rising body temperature would then trigger several homeostatic mechanisms. So including, in this case, increased transport of blood from your core of your body to the periphery, which is cooler. So the way we would, or one of the ways we would respond to exercising and getting really, really warm on a warm day is that the blood that's in the core, or the middle section of your body, mostly the torso, central area there, would then pump more blood out to the periphery. So like the fingers and the arms, the toes, the feet, those kinds of things, because it will be able to cool the blood that way. So it's one of the ways that our body can help to cool the system. As blood passes through the vessels of the skin, the heat would be then dissipated in the environment, so through the skin, through the extremities. And then the blood that's returning to the core of the body, the center area there, would then be cooler. So then, of course, the opposite would happen as well. So it says, in contrast, on a cold day, the blood that's diverted away from the skin, or the blood is diverted away from the skin area, away from the extremities, to maintain a warmer body core. So it kind of pulls it in to try to keep it warmer in that core area that's got more fat stores and some more bones and things like that to kind of keep it warmer, and other organs, the digestive system, etc. So in extreme cases, it mentions, just as a side note, that this, when it extremely, or happens in an extreme sense, then that's actually resulting in frostbite, where the blood is so far pulled into the body that you're not getting the blood flow that you need in, say, your fingers or toes, for example. So blood also helps down here to maintain the chemical balance of the body. Proteins and other compounds in blood act as buffers, which we'll talk about, and help to regulate the pH of the body tissues. Remember, our body has to be a specific pH, and we'll talk a little bit about the pH. Blood also helps to regulate the water content of body cells. So that's something we'll talk about specifically in the urinary system, but it's good to note here that the amount of fluid that is in our blood plasma can then be shifted and changed depending on how much we're taking in and how much we're excreting via, for example, sweat or urination. If we're taking in a lot of diuretics, we may be urinating out a lot of fluids, and our body can adjust. The blood helps to regulate that. So then we're going to move down to the composition of blood down here. So we'll scroll up here and get onto almost our whole next page here. At the beginning, up at the top here, it says you have probably had blood drawn from a superficial vein in your arm. We'll talk about which one that is when we do our laboratory, which was then sent to a lab for analysis. So we're going to move on to the next page here. And here, the most common blood tests, for instance, those measuring lipid or glucose levels in plasma, determine which substances are present within the blood and at what quantities. So we're going to talk a bit about some of those quantities here. So other blood tests check for the composition of blood. So we'll talk about some of these things. So one such test here is the hematocrit. The hematocrit is going to measure the percentage of, this is red blood cells, so RBCs are red blood cells, which are clinically known as erythrocytes. So you need to know all of those things. So red blood cells, which is pretty easy to remember as RBCs, but then also you need to know erythrocytes. And we're going to talk more about, very specifically, erythrocytes in the next kind of section of this chapter. So that'll be a reminder. It is performed by spinning the blood sample in a centrifuge. So a hematocrit is done by taking the blood sample. So if you have blood drawn from, most often from the arm, it is in a tube and it is put in the centrifuge. And then it causes those heavier elements, see, it says here the heavier elements that are in the blood sample to separate from the lightweight liquid plasma. So basically what we're doing is we're pulling down those formed elements. And of those formed elements, we've got the blood. You can see in the picture here on the hematocrit here is this section here, the red blood cells, is the heaviest, or are the heaviest. So they move down to the bottom of the tube when they're in the centrifuge. And then we have our buffy coat here, the white blood cells, or the platelets, which is a very small section. Maybe you can see it there since I haven't drawn all over it. And then up in the top here, we have our lighter weight, which we had just mentioned, the plasma, which contains the water, but then also some proteins, nutrients, hormones, and things like that, which we'll talk more about. So it mentions in that paragraph there, the heaviest elements are the erythrocytes, and they settle to the bottom. Located above that is the pale thin layer. So it's a very, very thin layer. You can see there the buffy coat right here, the buffy coat, because of its color, looks kind of like a buff color. And that, as you can see, a very small percentage, generally about 1% of the blood sample. So then above that buffy coat there is the blood plasma, and that's normally pale, kind of straw colored, which is the rest of it. So the volume of erythrocytes after centrifugation is also referred to right here as the PCV, the packed cell volume. In normal blood, when we're talking about packed cell volume, or the PCV, it's about 45%. So when we're talking about just red blood cells, we're talking about 45% of the blood that is drawn should be erythrocytes, or red blood cells. The hematocrit of any one sample can vary significantly, though. So it really depends on pretty much everything that you can think of. So age, gender, physical fitness level, weight, all of these different things. So that's why it says about 45%. So it can go anywhere. Here is our average, or kind of area here, the 36 to 50% according to gender, and then they lump the rest in with other factors there. So normal hematocrit values for females, this is interesting, is, or to me anyway, is 37 to 47. with a mean value of 41. And then for males here, the hematocrit ranges between 42 and 52 with a mean of 47. So this is due to several factors. In general, females tend to be a little bit smaller than males, just in height and weight, again, in general. But then also many females go through menstruation, so they lose a lot of that blood on a monthly basis. And so males tend to hang on to it for a lot longer because there isn't a lot of blood loss in general. And so then females have this a little bit lower hematocrit, along with other things, all the same other things, age, weight, exercise, muscle volume, things like that. So the percentage here of other formed elements, the white blood cells and platelets, is very small. So it's not normally considered with hematocrit. So they don't include this buffy coat down here, the white blood cells and the platelets, with the hematocrit. It's just very, very tiny. So we're really talking about, when we say taking hematocrit, we're talking about just the red blood cells. The mean plasma percentage is the percent of blood that is not erythrocytes. So for females, it's approximately 59. So the 100 minus the average, right, or the mean rather, of 41. And for males, it's approximately 53, which is the 100 minus the mean, which was 47. So then we're going to jump down past this. We have this picture here, and we're going to talk more about these at the end of the blood chapter here, talking about different disorders of blood. But you can see here that just a general anemia, which you may have heard of, which is, well, there are different types of anemia. But in this case, the anemia that it's showing is a depressed hematocrit. So you can see the amount of red blood cells here, the hematocrit for the red blood cells here, is much lower than here, which is the normal blood. And then polycythemia, you can probably guess what polycythemia means based on this hematocrit. You can see there's many, many more red blood cells than in anemia, and then in normal blood as well. So our characteristics of blood, when you think about blood, the first characteristic that probably comes to mind is the color, right? So we think of blood, we think about red. So blood that has just taken up oxygen is actually bright red, and the blood that has released oxygen in the tissues is more of a dusky red. So that's kind of an important thing to remember. Perhaps you think of that anyway. When you think about blood, perhaps you've gotten blood on something, you've gotten a cut, and then you've gone to go get a Band-Aid or something, and then the blood has dried up on the counter or whatever it is if you're cutting something. And the color has changed. It's become more dusky red. It's because some of the oxygen is leaving that blood. And the hemoglobin, here it mentions the hemoglobin, is a pigment that changes color depending on the degree of oxygen saturation. So in that case, when the oxygen has left, it's more of a dusky red. The reason that I bring that up, not just to point out the fact that blood gets darker when it dries, is that when we look at models or when we look at pictures, which likely you've all seen already, we see that a lot of the blood vessels, even in the heart, are colored red and then colored blue. So there's the red and the blue. That is really just as a learning mechanism to make sure that we're very, very clear about what vessels are transporting blood that is oxygenated, so having come from the lungs and has received oxygen, and what blood is deoxygenated, so without oxygen, deoxygenated. So that's really just to be very clear while studying blood flow and studying the different organs in the body systems. And in an actual human, that's not the case. So if one were to be doing surgery, there are not very brightly blue colored veins and very brightly red colored vessels. So that's a good thing to keep in mind, even though you may already know that blood changes color over time. But anyway, so moving on. Blood is viscous. It's kind of thick. It's not as thin as water, so viscous and somewhat sticky to the touch. Maybe you've recalled that from a cut. It has we're right here, a viscosity approximately 5 times greater than water, right? So viscosity is the measure of a fluid's thickness or resistance to flow, so it doesn't flow as easily as water, which is influenced by the presence of the plasma proteins and formed elements within the blood. So of course, when you add stuff to the blood, it's going to get thicker or more viscous, I guess is technically the correct term there. So the viscosity of blood has a dramatic impact on blood pressure and flow. And we're going to talk about blood pressure and even do some lab work with blood pressure and flow. So here it says, just as an example, consider the difference between the flow in water and honey. So they both have different viscosities. Honey is more viscous, so it has a greater resistance to flow. It flows much slower than the less viscous water. And the same thing applies to the blood. The normal temperature of blood is slightly higher than normal body temperature, so at about 38 degrees C or 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit compared to when we stick a thermometer in our mouth and take our temperature of the 98.6 that we're familiar with, or the 37 degrees C. For an internal body temperature reading, that's the temperature when we use our thermometer. Although there are variations, of course. So when we get hotter, as the sun comes out and we're sitting in the sun, for example, that can change if we don't move right away. Or if we go outside and it's wintertime and we've been out there for a while, those things can change. Here it mentions, although the surface of the blood vessels is relatively smooth, as blood flows through them, it experiences some friction and resistance, especially as the vessels age and lose their elasticity. And then it produces more heat. So if something has more friction, maybe you can think about taking your hands and putting them together like clapping, and then you can rub them very fast together, and then you can produce heat, right? It starts to warm up your hands. Maybe you do that in the winter for that exact reason. And that's because there's friction between the two hands. And so that same thing is happening with the interior lining of our blood vessels. Even though they are relatively smooth so that blood can move through there, it does create some friction, as two things moving across each other will. And as those get built up with plaque, for example, as we age, as the elasticity of all of the parts of our body are decreasing, then it'll actually produce more and more heat. And that can also account for a slightly higher temperature. So perhaps a person that has aged has a different temperature, or a different base body temperature than when they were younger. Moving on to the next page here then, on page 786. The pH of the blood averages about 7.4, but again, there are ranges, even in a healthy person, depending on what's being eaten, what has been drank, exercise, age, all of these different things. So blood, as you can see, so remember 7 is a neutral pH. So, well, that's terrible handwriting. That's supposed to say neutral. I'll work on that. Blood is therefore, so remember, neutral is 7. And so it's actually a little bit more basic or alkaline here on the chemical scale than pure water, which would be that 7. Right here it is. I didn't need to write it. pH 7. So blood contains numerous buffers that actually help to regulate the pH. So we've got buffers in our system that are going to help. If we become really, really acidic, it'll bring it back down to the alkaline. If we become really, really alkaline, it can bring it back up. Of course, there are disorders of that where we have some issues with those things, but those systems are there. Blood constitutes approximately 8% of adult body weight. An adult male, in this case, averages about 5 to 6 liters of blood, and females 4 to 5 liters. And again, that's related to size. Generally, females tend to be a little bit smaller than males, and then also due to that menstruation. So we're going to start by talking about the blood plasma more specifically, and then we'll move into the formed elements. So like other fluids in the body, plasma is composed primarily of water. So we have a lot of water in our blood plasma. We store a lot of water there, and that's also where it's filtered. So in fact, it is about 92% water. Dissolved or suspended within its water, or this water is a mixture of substances here, mostly which are proteins. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Down here you can see we're going to talk about the plasma proteins, and then we'll talk about the other plasmasolutes on the bottom. So there are literally hundreds of substances dissolved or suspended in the plasma, although many are found in very small quantities. So we're going to talk about kind of the main ones here, albumin, the globulins, and fibrinogen, and then we'll talk, give a kind of quick overview of some other things. We're not going to get into the super serious stuff. Maybe you'll do that in medical school if you're headed that direction, but we'll talk about some of them here. So we'll talk about the plasma proteins then. So about 7% of the volume of plasma Nearly all that is not water is made up of proteins. We just said that's a major part of blood plasma. These include several plasma proteins, proteins that are unique to the plasma. So that's why they're called plasma proteins. Rather than just saying proteins, we can say plasma proteins because that's where they kind of belong. That's where they're housed. Plus a much smaller number of regulatory proteins, including enzymes and some hormones. So those wouldn't be specific to the plasma. Those would be able to go other places as well. Hormones are produced in the endocrine system. And we've got enzymes, lots of them in the digestive system, for example. So those aren't specific to blood. And so here we are. We have our 3 major groups of plasma proteins. Here, kind of drew over it, is albumin. So it's the most abundant of the plasma proteins. So it's important to know is that albumin is the number 1 plasma protein that we have in the blood. It is made in the liver. And what does albumin do? Albumin molecules serve as binding proteins. So albumin is very important. It's used as a transport vehicle for fatty acids and steroid hormones. So when we're talking about albumin, it's important to remember that it is made in the liver and it is a binding transporting protein. So it helps to take fatty acids and steroid hormones and get them into the blood and transport them. So here it describes, remember here, that lipids are hydrophobic. Hydro meaning water and phobic meaning scared of or stays away from. So lipids, fats, are hydrophobic. They don't mix well. The oil and water example that they don't mix. And binding to albumin is going to enable their transport in the watery plasma. So if we took a glass of water, for example, and dumped some vegetable oil or olive oil or something in there, we would see that it just kind of sits at the top. It kind of comes to the surface and floats to the top. Even if we shake up that container, they don't mix together, and then the oil will then float right back up to the top of the water. So in order for that to not happen with the fat that we eat, to be able to get it into our different organs, we have plasma protein like albumin that is going to grab those lipids, and we'll talk more about this actually in the digestive system, how specifically it does this, but it will bind to them and then it will carry them through that watery, remember 92% water blood plasma. So it's going to transport them. It's also the most significant contributor to osmotic pressure in the blood. So we have these really large proteins, the albumin proteins, floating around here, just trying to grab up lipids, steroid hormones, which are very fatty. Steroid, remember, is a derivative of cholesterol. And it's grabbing onto these guys and pulling them to where they need to go. And so that's going to be a major contributor to pressure. So lots of those things moving around in the blood. So its presence holds water inside the blood vessels. So if you have if you remember back to either general bio or maybe a little bit in the first semester of anatomy and physiology, talking about osmotic pressure and talking about osmosis, which is where that comes from. So talking about perhaps the plasma membrane in a cell as a good example, and how if there are lots of solutes inside of the cell, then the water is going to flow into that cell to try to dilute the solutes and make it equal on both sides. When we're talking about having a large amount of albumin floating around, trying to grab up these lipids and get them where they need to go, then it's going to be pulling that water into the blood vessels there. So its presence holds the water inside the blood vessels because it's trying to travel across that border to dissolve those to make it equal on both sides. So it can draw water from the tissues across the blood vessel walls and into the bloodstream. So this in turn helps to maintain both blood volume. So that's beneficial to make sure that we get water into the bloodstream so that it can continue doing that. So it can continue bringing oxygen and nutrients and transporting our wastes. And it also contributes to blood pressure, which even though I think a lot of times when we think about blood pressure, that's kind of a word that brings negative things, it's important for us to have blood pressure because if we had low blood pressure, which you may have also heard of before, it makes it really difficult for our heart to pump even with low blood pressure. So it is important for us to have these things in the bloodstream that's going to maintain an appropriate blood pressure. So albumin normally accounts for about 54% of the total plasma protein content. So when we're talking about plasma proteins, and we say the majority or the most abundant plasma protein is albumin, we're really talking about over half of all of the plasma proteins is albumin, and that's why it's very important to know about it. So in clinical levels, here we're talking about 3.5 to 5 grams per deciliter of blood. That's that increment there. So we're going to move on and talk about now the second most common plasma proteins are the globulins. Heterogeneous group. There are 3 main subgroups known as the alpha, the beta, and the gamma globulins. The alpha and the beta globulins are transport globulins or transport proteins. They transport the iron here. You can see iron, lipids, and the fat-soluble proteins involved in immunity, and are better known as antibodies or immunoglobulins. So, I'm sorry, we skipped down here. Fat-soluble vitamins, scratch that. So the alpha and beta globulins, I got ahead of myself, transport iron, lipids, and the fat-soluble vitamins, sorry, not fat-soluble proteins, but fat-soluble vitamins, A, D, E, and K, to the cells. So like albumin, they also contribute to osmotic pressure. So again, if they're pulling these big things, if you're grabbing, if you are a alpha or beta globulin, you're grabbing these fat-soluble vitamins, which can be rather large, you're grabbing iron, you're grabbing lipids, and trying to bring them to the cells, then you're going to be rather large and contributing to the osmotic pressure. The gamma globulins, I was a little confused what I was saying there. The gamma globulins here are the proteins that are involved in immunity. And they're better known as the antibodies or the immunoglobulins. So again, sorry about that, the alpha and the beta are the transporters. They transport these different vitamins, the fat-soluble ones, because the water-soluble ones don't need it because they can just flow right through the water. But the fat-soluble ones, right, would float to the surface like oil on water. So we have to have a transporter, and the alpha and beta globulins do that. They also transport iron and lipids. And then the third group of globulins are the gamma globulins, and they are involved in immunity. We're going to talk more about those as well, and they are called antibodies or immunoglobulins. So although there are other plasma proteins, they're produced by the liver. So remember, the albumin was produced by the liver. The immunoglobulins or the gamma globulins are produced by specialized leukocytes, known as plasma cells. So leukocytes, we'll talk about also. Leukocytes is the technical term for the white blood cells, or the WBCs, known as plasma cells, which we'll talk about shortly. And here it says seek additional content for more about immunoglobulins. We'll be talking about that a lot when we talk about blood typing later, and then also when we talk about the immune system. So globulins make up approximately 38% of the total plasma protein volume, and these are the clinical levels here, the 1.0 to 1.5 grams per deciliter of blood. So we talked about albumin, which is the most abundant of the plasma proteins. Remember, that is important in the whole oil and water don't mix kind of thing, binding, transporting the fatty acids and the steroids, getting them to their cells where they need to go. 54% of the plasma proteins are albumin. Then the second most common are the globulin groups, which are the alpha and the beta, which work similarly to albumin but also transport the fat-soluble vitamins. The gamma globulins or immunoglobulins or antibodies are then the third group there. And then the least abundant plasma protein that we'll talk about is fibrinogen. And like albumin and the alpha and beta globulins, fibrinogen is produced by the liver, right? So albumin produced by the liver, the alpha and beta globulins produced by the liver, and fibrinogen produced by the liver. All the things that are going to be binding and transporting and kind of sticky and fatty, I guess you can kind of think of it, because fibrinogen, we're going to talk about in just a moment, is for clotting and stickiness, all come from the liver. The gamma globulins, remember, are part of the immune system in a way that they are made by leukocytes, which are the white blood cells. So, what is fibrinogen? It is important for blood clotting, and we're going to talk about later in the chapter exactly how that works. So, fibrinogen accounts for about 7% of the total plasma protein volume. So here we have our 0.2 to 0.45 grams per deciliter of blood. So you can see how different that is from the albumin, which was almost 5 grams per deciliter, depending. So then we're going to talk about our other plasmasolutes. And I'm going to scroll up here just so that you can kind of take a look at this chart down here at the same time. So in addition to proteins, plasma contains a wide variety of other substances. These include various electrolytes such as sodium, potassium, and calcium. Maybe you remember that from 271, talking about the very important need for sodium, potassium, and calcium, talking about membrane potentials, right? Nervous potential, or in the nervous system. Dissolved gases such as oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen. So those are all very important. We'll talk about the respiratory system and why these are important, although perhaps you already know oxygen is important, and getting rid of carbon dioxide. And various organic nutrients such as vitamins, lipids, glucose, and amino acids. We have our metabolic wastes as well. So these are kind of all of the other things that blood does. Blood moves these things through. We're talking about some of our electrolytes that are important, some of our gases that are important for transport, but mostly what we have in here are a lot of those plasma proteins. So this kind of continues down here. All of these non-protein solutes combined contribute approximately to 1% of the total plasma volume. So really, really small for everything else. Here's a nice little chart to kind of sum up things. And you should be familiar with this, not necessarily the chart format, but what's in the chart. So here is the component and percent of the blood. So we have the plasma. Remember we talked about the plasma, if you remember back to the hematocrit. When we looked at that here, the plasma is this major portion up top. And then we have the buffy coat with the white blood cells and the hematocrit with the red blood cells. So if we move back down here and talk about our major components, our plasma is major there, and then we have our formed elements here. And then here are the subcomponents and percentage of those components. So remember we talked about our blood plasma as being mostly water, 92%. And then we have our plasma proteins at 7%, our regulatory proteins, and our other solutes. And then we just talked about the type and percentage where appropriate. We didn't talk about a lot of the percentage, but so water is a fluid. It allows things to move through. We talked about albumin specifically as being the largest in quantity for these plasma proteins. Then we talked about the globulins and fibrinogen. The site of production, remember we've got liver here for albumin, liver for the alpha globulins, liver for the beta globulins, and liver for the fibrinogen. And then remember we've got these gamma globulins, which are made by plasma cells. And then this sums up the major functions here. So again, if we're talking about the water, we're talking about it's the transport medium. It's what is allowing all these things to flow through. Albumin maintains the osmotic concentration, transport lipids. Our alpha globulins here, remember, for transport, again, maintains osmotic concentration as well, because there's a lot of them. And the beta globulins, those same two things, transport and the osmotic concentration. And then we have our gamma globulins, which we'll talk a lot more about, as part of our immune response. And then lastly, out of those plasma proteins, we have our fibrinogen, which is important for blood clotting and hemostasis, which we'll talk a lot more about shortly. Our regulatory proteins are the hormones and enzymes coming from various sources, and then they regulate the various body functions, which we'll talk about, and you probably already have talked a lot about in 271 when talking about the endocrine system. And then we'll talk about those different things as we go system by system. It's just kind of a generalization here. And then the other solutes, the nutrients, gases, and wastes, absorbed by the intestinal tract and exchanged in the respiratory system or produced by other cells. It's also very general, and we'll talk about it in each specific instance when we're talking about the different systems. Numerous and varied, it is very, very different what each one of those things do. So then when we look down here at the formed elements, we've already mentioned kind of the percentage that they make up. And then what we're going to do in the next couple of sections is we're going to talk about specifically the erythrocytes, which are 99% of the form elements. We'll talk about leukocytes. So remember, our erythrocytes are the red blood cells. Leukocytes are the white blood cells. And then we have the platelets there. And we're going to talk about each one of those very specifically. And then we're going to leave all of this information for when we talk about those, and we can kind of go back and summarize these things. So this is a really good summary to return to after we've talked about all of these different things. And as you're studying, I think this is a very important chart to be looking at, so that it's very easily and nicely organized. So moving on, we have chapter 18.2, so the production of the formed elements. So we're going to start getting into, we have talked about the plasma here. So remember our two parts here, component of blood. We have talked about the plasma. We're done talking about the plasma now, and we're going to move into this section down here, the formed elements. And we'll start with the red blood cells. So here we go, chapter 18.2.